الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين
Anyway, this is the cover slide, Civilization and Time, and the cartoon of the dinosaur driving a car is only half joking, as you'll see as I get into the talk. The middle picture shows, it's an artist's impression of an asteroid striking the Earth, and that's certainly much less controversial than a dinosaur driving a car.
You see the middle.
Yeah, that's the asteroid that supposedly struck near the Yucatan Peninsula about 65 million years ago and took out the dinosaurs along with about 75% of all the other species that were living 65 million years ago. So that's widely regarded as the most plausible explanation for what happened at that time, took out the dinosaurs. And these photographs on this far side are photos I took using a scanning electron microscope when I was doing my studies. These are particles that were preserved in the mud that was laid down 65 million years ago when this event occurred. So all these things we shall talk about. So just a prologue to the talk. Going back to 2008, I was living in Bloomington, Indiana, very nearby, just 2 blocks from Homer and Wendy here. And after I finished my master's, I managed to get a publication in geology from my master's research, and that had some interesting popular ideas in it that managed to get a bit of press. So this is going back to 2008, some of the headlines in the scientific press and general press that came out of the publication. So I won't go into the articles themselves, but we'll start to talk a little bit about the background of how I came to do a master's and what motivated me to do it.
Sarah.
Space is vast, so is time, and this is a recurring theme and one that's worth revisiting. So in astronomy, if you look at space, the way humans used to think about space, and in the Dark Ages and prior civilizations, used to think of Earth as being at the centre of things, really, the centre of the action. So when you looked up in the sky in the morning, and in the afternoon, the sun sort of made an arc as it went over us. It was like we were in the middle and the sun was moving around us. And the moon did the same sort of thing, and the stars did the same sort of thing. So not having looked into it very much, a lot of early civilizations and theologians thought, we're at the centre of the universe, and we're unique and very special and divine, and this all makes sense. It's logical that we would be created at the centre of things. Very important and unique. And then, Dark Ages ended, and we realised, probably Copernicus was one of the first scientists to realise that we're not at the centre of the universe, and actually we go around the sun. And the sun is just a regular old star that rotates around the centre of the galaxy. And the galaxy is just one of many, thousands of millions of galaxies that exist in the universe. And it's just, we're completely insignificant, really, and nothing particularly special about our place in space. So where are we today? Well, everybody sort of takes that as granted now. We all know that we're nothing. Our position in space is not particularly special, but we still sort of think about our position in time as being rather special. So we assume that there's never been an us beforehand. And by us, I mean like an advanced techno-civilization, something with factories and roads and buildings and music and philosophy and microchips, all that stuff. This is the first one. So if you think about it, we have an infinity of time before us, and we have an infinity of time afterwards. So on a timeline, if you think of like a road of time, we're right in the middle. We think we're right in the centre, just like we thought we were in space. So we have infinity of time before us and infinity afterwards, and we're right in the middle. So it's sort of analogous to the way we used to think about our position in space, the way we used to think about position in time. Interestingly, there was a lot of resistance from theologians when Copernicus suggested that we were not at the centre of space. So space is vast, so is time. And just to give some sort of idea of just how large time is, I just drew up this table. So the Industrial Revolution, I mean, if you think about if time is a road, and 1 inch is 100 years, then the Industrial Revolution began about 150 years ago, which is 1.5 inches on this road. It's not too far away at all. Christ was walking the streets of the Middle East 20 inches down the road, less than a yard. And this column's worth looking at as well. What remains of the Industrial Revolution, only 1.5 inches down the road? Oh, you can see that in Hartford. I think this is an old city, and if you visit the cemeteries, the tombstones from 150 years ago, they start to look a bit like they've been eroded. They're missing bits of concrete. A little bit of acid rain maybe is eaten into the... they get harder to read, those tombstones, as they get older. They just get broken down by physical and chemical processes. When you get back to the time of Christ, 20 inches down the road, what have we got left? Well, most of those remains from the time of Christ are buried. There's rubble from old buildings, probably tools and bones you can find, if lots of that stuff. But we're only 20 inches down the road. If you want to go back 300,000 years, jump 2 orders of magnitude. This is the first anatomically modern humans, and we're still only 3,000 inches down the road. It's only 0.47 of a mile. And all we've got from that time are bone fragments from humans and the odd tool. There's really very little that remains to be found. And then let's jump another 2 orders of magnitude. The dinosaur extinction, 65 million years ago. Now we're talking 10 miles down the road. It's a big jump. That's like from here to Simsbury. And what's left at that time that we can hold in our hand? Very little. Very, very little. You get dinosaur bones that get fossilised in those old muds, but they're hard to find. You've got to be a specialist to find those big objects. Most of what remains is in the geochemical fossil record. So you can find rock outcrops that are preserved from 65 million years ago, and you can study those rock outcrops and find little things. Molecular geochemists look at the molecules in those sediments that were preserved from that time. And plankton as well. So the shells of planktonic organisms are preserved in those sediments. So it's the little things that tend to get preserved more than the big things from that time period. You go back another order of magnitude to the Cambrian explosion. So what this was, 500 million years ago, something happened on Earth, and we start to see the evolution of multicellular life. So this is when we're going from the sort of the bacterial stage to more complicated organisms. And what remains from 85 miles, so getting up to Northampton, sort of that far down the road. Remember, Christ was 20 inches away. Now we're getting to Northampton sort of distance from here. And all you've got is very, very rare fossilised remains. It's very hard to find any fossilised remains from the Cambrian explosion time. And you get, of course, geochemistry is much easier to find. And then when you get back to the earliest Earth, there's really nothing from 4 billion years ago. There might be some stuff from between 3 to 4 billion years ago, but it's not much. It's very hard to find anything at the Earth's surface that was around at the Earth's surface 10.4 billion years ago. Okay? So, time's vast. So just shifting gear a little bit, the Fermi paradox. What's this? Has anyone ever heard of it before? Yeah.
Yeah,
You can get it. I can't remember it.
Well, he was a physicist, and what he was thinking about is, geez, the universe is really big, and you've got 100,000 million stars in our galaxy, and 100,000 million galaxies in the universe, and there's nothing particularly special about our star. And this has been confirmed recently, right? They're finding planets all over the place on different stars. And he's thinking that there's so many worlds out there, potential worlds. Why do we not have people knocking down our door every day of the week saying hi? I mean, surely there should be other advanced life out there that can has developed interstellar travel and can come and either conquer us, or or say hi. But we haven't heard a word. Nothing. There's been no concrete evidence of any kind of visitation or evidence of other, strong evidence of other civilizations. So the question is, where is everybody? What's going on? And it's, so it's an apparent paradox. And one of the more popular answers, people have come up with various answers for why that is. It's the nature of intelligent life to destroy itself. So relatively quickly, soon after you develop higher technologies, if you like, life tends to or civilization tends to burn out very quickly. So there's a very, although there's billions of stars out there, there's also billions of years, right? So when you're looking at a star 20 light years away, you're looking at it as it was 20 years ago. But most stars are much further away than that. They're thousands of light years away or millions of light years away. So there's just, you're actually looking through time. You look out into space. And if there's only a 200 window of opportunity, say for example, in which an intelligent civilization develops radio waves or anything else, it's only a really small opportunity to catch a glimpse of them before they're gone. So that was one theory put forward to explain why we might not have visitors.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Is there any logic behind that answer? Why is it that an intelligent life is expected to destroy itself?
Very, very good question.
It's just a theory that somebody proposed, right?
Yeah. So
it's not like the answer to Fermi's paradox. It's one attempt.
I guess-
It's like us with
His
nuclear
evidence is
weapons.
the lack of an appearance of another civilization visiting us. That's his supposed evidence.
Like,
yeah,
why would they
I
want
guess you
to
could
be
look at
a
Easter
news?
Island as well.
Excuse me? What was it? Somebody said something in the middle there? You say something?
I said, why would they want to visit us if we have nukes? That's the whole point.
Is it based on they're just using up natural resources? Is that where the theory comes from? Or, I mean, the answer?
Right. So, I mean, there are plenty of people that are very worried today about the direction humanity is taking. So I guess you could. This is just a theory. So you're right. There's very little evidence
It
that.
sounds like an assertion,
Yes.
and not even a theory or a hypothesis that you can test. There is no way to
No,
test that
that's right.
assertion.
That's right.
So it's just a claim
Well,
that I personally disagree and don't accept.
Absolutely, sure. So there are, right, so there are two different philosophies, if you like, broadly speaking. There are the technologists that believe in technology, and that can solve our problems. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are people that think technology is bad, and it's going to wipe us out. And then you've got all the people in the middle, sort of that think.
Mark.
Yeah.
As I said in the introduction, this dovetails with a big discussion in archaeology, which is closely aligned with with the things you're talking about. The phenomenon of cultural decline, that great societies that we've noticed in the past, that archaeologists, even ones that we're just digging up now, the great societies seem to have declined, and so there seems to be, and so that would at least be a basis for evidence. Now, as far as when you say how are you going to test it, well, different sciences have different limitations as far as testing. Obviously, you can't go back in history, but I guess you can test it by, the only way we can test it is by seeing the civilizations that have, great civilizations that have existed in human history and prehistory also, and that have declined. Just as a footnote, I agree with Farhad that I don't think that that's true. I don't think it's the nature of intelligent life to destroy itself. But I do see how archaeological evidence might be taken to support that.
Okay. Yeah. It's a very good question, and yeah, there are people that are on both sides of that argument, certainly. Yeah. Anyway, it's the assumption that I went with in my research. So if you like, I'm a pessimist, if you like, whereas you are an optimist. Right? In that sense.
Well, I base my the chronology of the Earth that you presented just a few minutes ago, if we go back and map out the human population, it has exploded in the past since the Industrial Revolution. We've gone from about 900 million to now more than 7 billion. And people are living much longer, healthier life. Of course, you know, there are a lot of problems. Nobody can deny that. But I have no reason to believe that an intelligent life has a tendency to destroy itself.
Well, here's one thing to think of. There, right now, as of today, there are, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, there are like alternative archaeological timelines that are coming up just now. That some, you know, people in different fields point to different abilities within civilizations to have more advanced life or interstellar life here on Earth. There are things that completely surpass anything we have ever even known to be like the history of mankind before us. So there's on the logistics side, you have to consider that, you know, we're just at that point, like you were saying here, but there's still stuff coming up in the fields, and there's, you know, the gatekeepers that are not wanting to consider this. It would ultimately shake and rock our world. There are many other things to consider, but I highly suggest you look into it. It's really cool.
Yes.
And this is also sort of trying to extrapolate to other intelligent life based on, you know, what the 2 inches that we have of, I mean, who thinks intelligent life anyplace else would be anything like what we've ever experienced on this? And that seems a weird thing to even assume. That even if we could convince ourselves that, yeah, all of our civilizations will destroy themselves, that has nothing to do with other intelligent life. Good point.
Yes. Yep.
So the way I see that statement, it is an interesting statement, and it's plausible. I'm not going to rule it out. I assert that I see life from a biomedical perspective. Obviously, I'm a nurse, right? That's how I'm trained. So maybe instead of us trying to destroy ourselves, maybe we have a limited life cycle.
Yeah.
Take it down to a micro level, an individual level. We all have a limited time span on Earth. Maybe we can extrapolate that into the universe. And along with that, it's interesting that with the advancement of technology, certainly in the healthcare field, we are limited in terms of saving the human life. Technology is not the end all. There is a limited lifespan no matter what you do for the individual. So I feel more comfortable with the idea of maybe the universe it goes through ripples like the human existence. Maybe there's only a certain amount of time, and then it starts all over again.
Yeah, I like that.
It cleanses, it's like a purging, like it cleanses itself.
Yeah, so life started off as single cellular, and then you had multicellular life. But in both cases, the life is mortal. So the life of the bacteria is mortal.
Limited.
And the life of the multicellular organism, the colonial organisms as well, they're mortal as well. They have a juvenile stage, they mature, and then they age and die. And maybe civilization is nothing more than a complex organism.
Exactly.
And what we've done is go through a period of growth.
Yes.
We've come to maturity now as a civilization. And what we have to do, whether or not we're mortal or immortal is another question, but what we have to do is recognize that as you get to the end of your teenage years, you've got to be careful and start thinking about the future. You've got to save money, you've got to stop taking drugs and drinking so much. Don't drink and drive. There's sort of a responsibility that comes with maturity if you want to get to your 30s and your 40s and your 50s and your 60s. You have to start making decisions about certain things anyway.
You sounded like my doctor. He says you have to keep making decisions on a continual basis. You have to take away something more, add something more, and all the time, if you plan on living.
Yeah. Anyway, some people, sort of carry on as if we can just extract all the resources we want from the world and stuff tomorrow. And other people think, well, no, we've got to be very, very conservative about the way we
Right.
approach the future. Yeah, it's just two different philosophies. And I've gone with that. I've been more conservative in my approach to this study. Okay, so here's another interesting point. We already know that human techno-industrial civilization is producing a mass extinction now, and this has been widely written about in the literature. So one of the things if you think about what we're going to leave in the fossil record 60 million years from now, it's now generally accepted that one of the clearest indicators that we were ever here is going to be the loss of 50, 60, 70, 80% of all the species on the planet. Now that is freaky, but anyway. So what if an advanced techno-industrial civilization previously existed on Earth but was necessarily short-lived? I don't mean humans. I'm assuming it's the nature of intelligent life to destroy itself, or at least a large proportion of them, maybe not all. This issue would seem to have relevance today. Civilizations may be mortal, and this is what I just mentioned. It's a little bit like a youth getting to the end of its adolescence. Then you experience maturity, then death. Also, what about extraterrestrial civilizations? May not have evolved here. Maybe we had a visitor at some point, set up a civilization here, and then moved on or died out. That's also a possibility. And then finding evidence for such a civilization could serve as a warning to people today and hopefully change attitudes. And this is all got me excited, and it's probably not going to get everybody excited, but there's sort of something that, hey, there was a civilization there, it wiped itself out, and there's all this evidence for what it did to wipe itself out. That could be a kind of a wake-up call for people today to behave in a more responsible way. So yeah.
Mark, just to bolster or at least give it some parallel evidence for the point about the possibility of great civilizations existing on Earth, that we find scant evidence that somebody might say, oh, if there were great civilizations, we would see the obvious cases of them. Well, archaeologists are now pretty convinced that there were great civilizations in what's now the Sahara Desert, but the desert environment pretty much destroys the possibility for any likelihood that we'll ever find the signs. We just find scant signs, but we see strange things in the Sahara Desert that definitely suggest there was great civilizations there. The Sahara Desert, as a desert, is only about 10 to 12,000 years old, and
yeah, it makes you wonder what caused the desertification.
Exactly.
Right? In Australia too.
Yeah, and the other case that we don't talk about, we know that we talk about Beringia, we talk about the land bridge, but we talk about it in this kind of time condensed way about, okay, a land bridge appeared, people came across, and then the land bridge left. But the last land bridge, and that's the one that before which there probably wasn't any human life coming across, because there were previous land bridges, was about 38 to 40,000 years ago, became a big, it wasn't a bridge, it was a big giant piece of land. It was a mild climate because of the southern waters coming up to the shore. It warmed, even though North America was completely glaciated, it warmed up a considerable portion of what's now Alaska. And that was Beringia, and that means that we could be pretty sure that humans could have lived there for about 25 to 30,000 years happily without trying to move in. And when you think of 25,000 years of human life in a rather Edenistic sort of environment, there could have been a great civilization there. And we won't know because of how it disappeared. It disappeared from ocean waters, from glaciation, and mostly ocean waters, and we're never going to find that out. But we have a lot of good reason to believe that there was some significant human cultural development that took place in Beringia. It's gone. So, in other words, don't think that if there were a great society on Earth at some time in the past, even a human one, which the Homo sapiens has existed for about 200,000 years as a species, don't think that we necessarily would be able to find evidence of it. Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, these are the thoughts that are in my head, sort of leading up to the decision to do a research project. So then it turns to the practicalities. All right, as a scientist, what can I do about it? What are the practicalities of looking for something? Well, you need evidence. Science needs evidence. One approach would be to assume a forward-thinking member of the previous civilization intentionally left a time capsule. And this is not a road I went very far down, but I think it's really interesting to think about. How would you leave a time capsule that would possibly be discovered by someone like me 10 million years into the future? It's a really interesting question because you've got plate tectonics that are moving. You'd have to find a place that was sort of so unique that someone like me would think someone would have left it in a place that was so unique. But even if you chose the North Pole, the poles move over a period of 10 million years. Very tough place to try and keep track of. So it's just really, it would be great to find a time capsule, but I don't see what's unique enough. Where the location would be, I don't know. It was a hard one. I didn't go that way. So yeah, you have to ask questions like where might they have left it? Where is that place today? And the other approach, which I've underlined because obviously this is the way I went, was to search for unintentionally left remains. So this is the other stuff that civilizations tend to leave behind. So what to look for? Well, you could look for something big, right? Remains of roads, buildings. The advantages of going down this road would be if you found it, it would be pretty hard to dismiss. If you find a fossilised road with rubbish, trash, fossilised in an outcrop, that would be really good evidence. You'd attract a lot of attention by finding something like that. It'd be hard to dismiss. The disadvantages of that, we would have found it by now. So,
by the way, have you seen how fast a road can go back to nature, almost to show no signs that it was ever there?
I know, it's amazing, isn't it?
When you're looking around where they have fast development.
Look, you could look for something small. So the advantages of looking for something small is that small things tend to be widespread. Okay, so given processes of atmospheric dispersal, you're talking particulates in the atmosphere, things get blown around and eventually incorporated with the sedimentary record. So just a bit of background for non-geologists on how this occurs. When little particles of dust, for example, get blown around, they end up in the ocean quite often. They'll settle out because of gravity. When they get into the ocean, they'll settle down through the ocean column because of gravity separation. And eventually they end up in the mud that's on the bottom of the ocean. And once they get into the mud, these muds are quite often anoxic. There's very little oxidation that occurs. And this is our fossil record. This is how things are mostly fossilised. The mud that's on the bottom of the ocean gets buried underneath more and more mud. And eventually it becomes compacted and these are the layers that geochemists and geologists study today to learn about the past. So that's a good advantage of something small, is that it can be widespread and it has good potential to be preserved. The other advantage that I thought this is a huge research gap as far as I could tell, and I'm thinking about this in 2003 when we had the internet, we had Google. I could see no one had looked at the Earth's sedimentary history to look for this stuff. It just hadn't occurred to people to even have a look. Probably because we just assume we're at the centre of time, and it's not. We have a very good grasp of evolution and the way animals have evolved, and we know that there isn't any possibility of this. So no one bothered to look. Research is more fundable, and okay. What I meant by that is there's a whole branch of science called geochemistry, where scientists get funding to look at the geochemistry of sediments from the Earth's history. And you don't have to go to a university when you're a prospective master's student and say, I'm looking for advanced civilizations. Can you give me some funding to do a master's? Because if you did that, no way. So what you have to do is come up with a research proposal that sounds like you're doing something that's more orthodox, when really what you're looking for is what you're looking for. Okay, so that was my approach. Disadvantages, it's more easily dismissed. So small stuff, much easier to dismiss than big stuff that you can see and hold and feel. If you find a mobile phone at the Ordovician-Silurian boundary, you're in business. No one can argue about that. But finding, DET or PCBs or little smoke particles, much less convincing. So you start. And again, I'm making assumptions here, and you are very welcome to criticise this, as I do myself. The key assumption is that techno-industrial civilizations produce the same kind of large and small things that we do, and who knows what another civilization might have produced. So some things are probably more generic than others, like fire is probably a good, the remains of fossil fuel might be a good candidate. Seems like a sure bet that any industrial techno-civilization on Earth that's worth its weight would learn how to use oil, right? It's a pretty rich source of energy. And if they use oil, they probably produce smoke from the oil, the kind of particles that get up into the atmosphere out of smokestacks and exhaust pipes and eventually get into the sedimentary record. Just a little bit of background on the second law of thermodynamics, which sounds terribly complicated, but really is the most simple thing you could possibly imagine. The second law of thermodynamics is basically the law of entropy, which suggests that over time, as time moves forward, things get broken down from complex structures into more simple structures. So if you leave a house of cards in your lounge, eventually it's going to get knocked down. You're going to lose the complexity of that structure of cards into a pile that's just a random pile of cards, because that's the direction of time. Things tend to get broken down, just like we do over time. You know, we're an adult, we're nice and organised, we function in an organised way. As you get older, things start to break down. Your teeth, your bones, your organs, everything. Eventually you're just a pile of bones, just random pieces. And ultimately, as time really goes by, you turn into dust, which is totally disorganised. This is the second law of thermodynamics. So the same thing happens to a building, right? You build a building, it's nice and organised, you can make sense of it, and eventually it starts to fall into disrepair. As time goes more and more size, as time goes by, it turns to rubble and then dust. So on this axis, we've got the size of the artifact. So eventually it starts off big, and over time, the second law of thermodynamics calls big objects to turn into smaller objects. That's just the way reality works. If you want to keep something big over time, you can. But what do you have to do? If you want to keep something big, you have to put in energy, which is the other side of the equation in that second law. It requires input to maintain an animal. If you take away our energy source, we die and we become less complex. If you take away the energy required to update a building, it will break down. Similarly, our civilization has been built on energy, particularly the last 150 years. The Industrial Revolution is built on energy. Fossil carbon. So, remains, what do we look for? I think something small is a better choice, some kind of particle or molecule. So what are the candidates? Well, I wanted something that a techno-civilization is likely to emit for a long time. Something that would be useful for them. Something that's chemically very stable. Okay, so some chemicals break down over time. They're not going to last 10 million years in the fossil record. Chocolate cake breaks down pretty quickly. Something that can be easily detected and recognised in the laboratory. Yeah, that's a big issue. So some really good tracers out there, but some of them are really expensive. You need special analytical equipment to detect certain types of organic molecules. To do stable isotope research takes specialist equipment. So I wanted something a bit simple for a master's project, something that I can get my hands on. Something not subject to contamination issues. That's a big thing. So if I'm out on an outcrop collecting samples, how can I be sure that this pollutant that I can detect in sediments didn't come from the side of the road, right? How do I know that when I'm taking my samples back to the laboratory, there isn't some sort of contaminant in the laboratory that can upset my samples and give me a false positive? And something that's unambiguously of industrial origin, that's pretty tough. Because as you get smaller and smaller, these particles are much harder to, it's much harder to defend. I've discovered an ancient civilization. People will say, no, those particles are contaminants, or those particles are produced naturally. So anyway, what were my candidates? Synthetic organic molecules, things like DDT. So there was a revolution in organic chemistry in the 30s, 40s, and 50s that produced things like DDT, which were used. They find DDT in ocean sediments, and it's interesting. It's an organic compound that's really long-lived. It's really persistent, which is one of the problems with it. You know, if if it gets into the food chain, it stops birds from being able to lay strong eggs. So this is why they outlawed DDT in the 60s. There was that book, The Silent Spring. It was written about DDT. And they outlawed it. But there's still plenty of the stuff in the fossil record. Wasn't as long-lived as I would hope for as a tracer. It was only around for 20 years, 30 years, and then they stopped. I think they still use it in some parts of the world. PCBs. So they use PCBs, polychlorobiphenyls, in insulating equipment and substations. So it's very good, very useful industrial chemical in capacitors. But yeah, highly toxic, long-lived, and it doesn't break down easily, so you tend to find it in sediments. And these things are toxic, so that's why they tend to get studied. This is why I can find out about them. There's lots of other ones that get produced, but these ones get studied a lot, and they were looking at them in the sediments because they're so toxic. So that's just a happy coincidence as far as I'm concerned. It gave me a literature that I could delve into and say, yeah, these things, if I found these things at some earlier Earth history boundary, that would be really good proof. And the techniques were there, the analytical techniques were there to isolate those from sediments because people were interested in them for other reasons. So soot, charcoal, these are the types of black carbon particles that come out of smokestacks, car exhausts. Microplastics, there's a lot of this in the media now, microplastics ending up in the oceans. So all the plastic that goes in the oceans eventually gets mechanically broken down into tiny little bits of plastic. And that stuff's eventually going to settle out of the water column into the sediments. It's a perfect tracer. I mean, this stuff is colour. Like imagine looking in your microscope at KT boundary samples and you see blues and reds and greens, little blobs of plastic. That'd be great evidence for a civilization. No way nature could make that by itself. Pigment number 15. Really, this is I think where I would go if I was moving ahead with more of this type of research. Isotopic abundances, so certain types of atomic processes, nuclear reactors can leave isotopes which are long-lived and have distinctive properties, possible. And trace metals as well. We produce a lot of mercury and lead in the environment from our fuels, coal. These trace metals, they're heavy metals, but they still get widely dispersed because they're particulates. So you could look for trace metal anomalies. And there's a body of literature where people are looking for this stuff already in the sediments, but recent sediments. They're looking at environmental contaminants for toxicology studies. So anyway, I made this little table up to sort of show my decision-making process, and you can see that I went with soot and charcoal mainly because it was easy to detect. You could use a light microscope or a scanning electron microscope to see this stuff. Whereas the synthetic organic molecules, it's hard to detect them. You need a gas chromatography. It was not something that I wanted to wade into at that point. And you have big contamination issues as well, synthetic and organic molecules. My supervisor ended up being an organic geochemist who was a real specialist in this stuff. But it looked like too hard, so I went with soot and charcoal. And I also found some great papers on soot and charcoal that convinced me that this was a really unambiguous marker of industrial activity. There are certain morphologies, certain types of soot and charcoal that are only produced by a coal-fired power plant. And there are guys that study this. There are people that look in the lake sediments and say, that's the onset of the Industrial Revolution. We can see it from these particular types of smoke particles that they digest the sediment, they soak it in acid, break it down, and then all that's left are these little black carbon particles that they can look at and identify and catalogue. Amazing. So there's some other ones there that I didn't go with.
Mark?
Yeah.
Can you explain why trace metals are not unambiguous?
Okay, very good question. So take the KT boundary, for example. The KT boundary is that layer of clay between the Cretaceous and the Paleocene, where the dinosaurs went extinct. Something happened on Earth to create this layer of clay. And in that clay, scientists have been looking for decades and decades, trying to figure out what the clues are in that clay that might give away what caused the dinosaurs to go extinct. And they cracked it. They think they found the answer, which still is consensus today. In 1980, a guy at Stanford, Walter Alvarez, found this layer of iridium, which is a trace metal in the clay. So iridium is a rare platinum group element. Very, very rare on the Earth's surface. But for some reason in this clay layer, the iridium is thick. So the hypothesis was, okay, where else could the iridium come from? Volcanoes? Not really. What about asteroids? And if you look at the composition of certain asteroids, they're really, really rich in iridium. So the hypothesis was an asteroid came down, vaporized and distributed all this iridium all over the Earth, and it ended up in the sediments. So trace metals, problematic because there can be other causes, maybe extraterrestrial, maybe volcanic. So yeah, and this sort of, I thought this maybe has philosophical implications or not. You be the judge. So I was sort of thinking about what to look for and pondering a suitable industrial tracer. I was sort of forced to think more carefully about what does synthetic really mean? What does it mean, a compound that's artificial? So it's interesting that as you get, if you look at the artifact site, so a building's really big, soot from an exhaust pipe, you have to look at it under an electron microscope, it's really small. But the frequency of preservation is really high for soot, because it just gets everywhere, you know. There's a really good chance you'll see it in a fossil record. Very, very low chance you'll see the building in the fossil record. So there's this relationship between artifact size and the frequency of preservation. And how do I tie that into what I'm saying here about synthetic? Just put that to one side for a sec. If you're thinking about the word synthetic, maybe that word itself is a bit synthetic, because if you think that human beings evolved naturally, if we're just a product of evolution, then everything, by definition, everything that we produce is just natural. So it's kind of, it's just hard to say when something is, what does synthetic really mean? You know, when you get to this very, very small size, it's like, the ambiguity is so high. The burden of proof seems to be much higher for small objects. So if you look at soot from exhaust, people are arguing, oh, this morphology is really characteristic of diesel engines, but really maybe it could be made by a forest fire. So the ambiguity, the burden of proof is so much higher if you choose a smaller size. So the artifact here is very small on the x-axis. So things like soot, very, very small artifact, very, very high burden of proof. It seems to be like some kind of natural law that's preventing you from, you know, from seeing something that might have been there in the past. So, yeah, it's like this whole thing's synthetic. What is synthetic? Once you get down to very, very small particles, anything that we can make, nature can make as well. So it gets harder as you look at smaller things. But they're everywhere, so that's good. Anyway, it was a bit of a sort of conundrum for me. So I thought it was analogous to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Have any of you guys heard of this one? Yeah. It's just, and it's my understanding, which may be a bit basic, tiny little particles that came out of particle physics in the 30s or 40s. They were trying to study these tiny little particles using highly powered electron microscopes or beams in physics laboratories. And the problem was, if you were trying to look at a particle, what you do is you fire another particle at it. And the very act of observing the particle changes the particle that you're looking at. So you can never be sure, like if you want to measure where the particle is or how fast it's going, you can never be exactly sure, because the very act of looking at it with a light beam causes the particle to ricochet off. So the smaller something it is, the harder it is to study. And that seemed to be analogous for the problem that I was looking at. That the smaller the particle was, it's great, it's widespread, it's going to be here, but it's really hard to say that's synthetic. Okay, so the next thought, once I'd settled on soot and black carbon as something to look for, where to look? And just look at that. That is a sediment column. Here you see one. That's the lower part of the Grand Canyon, right? Looking up to the plateau. So,
Which canyon is that?
I think it's the Grand Canyon. Maybe it's the Colorado River running down the bottom there. Yeah. So the river has cut this nice channel through the sediment, right? And then this is the Earth's sedimentary record going back a billion years or whatever. But there's a heck of a lot to check, so where do you look? How do you narrow the search down? Anyone have any suggestions?
Well, you look where there's something unusual.
Carbon dating?
Right, yeah. Something unusual, yeah, like what's one of my assumptions about, or what would be an unusual event in a fossil record? Something that we might do in a fossil record.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the iridium.
Mass extinctions. So the whole fossil record, the way, and I should have shown a geological column, the way geologists divide up the fossil record is into epochs. So, you have the Cretaceous, Paleocene, Silurian, Devonian, all these geological epochs are divided by mass extinction events, turnovers in the fossil record. So it's those boundaries between the different epochs where you would look. You don't look through a whole lot. Just take one of these layers here, and that's probably a boundary between two different epochs. Something happened to change what was going on in the environment. So you need a smoking gun, and that's sort of where I'm going here. Mass extinctions. So the really big ones in Earth history, there's been 5 in the past. You could look at any one of those 5 ones going back in time. As I said before, it's now being argued that we're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction. You want a nice complete sedimentary sequence that are accessible, and you want a pre-existing body of literature out there so that other people have studied it and understand it. So these were my candidates. The KT boundary, which is the extinction of the dinosaurs 55 million years ago, the PT boundary 250 million years ago, or maybe the Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum 55 million years ago. And I'm not going to go into the details of why these were the candidates, but sufficient to say the PT is the really big one. That was not over 90% of everything was wiped out. That was about 70% of species went extinct. And the PETM, I don't know how many species, but there were some other really interesting signals.
Sorry, what does PT stand for?
Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum. So about 55 million years ago, something happened on Earth to change the carbon isotope composition of the oceans. And it's a lot like what's happening today. So
I'm referring to the PT in the middle, the PT.
Oh, sorry, this is the Permo-Triassic boundary. So this is what they refer to as the Great Dines, the biggest mass extinction in Earth history.
So that's the dinosaur?
No, the dinosaurs were 65 million years ago.
What was extinguished then? I'm sorry, I'm not
The PT boundary?
up on my geology, right?
Yeah, okay, so before, in the Permian period, you had animals that preceded the dinosaurs.
Okay.
And you can look at those. And then the Triassic marked the beginning of the age of the dinosaurs. So you had dinosaurs evolving from 250 million years ago, and then the dinosaurs clocked out 65 million years ago. Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway. So yeah, my key assumption is that techno-industrial civilizations have a tendency to produce mass extinctions. So, KT boundary, this is sort of where I landed. Famous for the demise of the dinosaurs. 75 or more of all species went extinct. We have fantastic sedimentary sequences available for study, and a massive pre-existing body of literature looking at the geochemistry of that clay layer that exists all over the world between the Cretaceous and the Tertiary sediments. So just a brief mention of my methods. So I went to New Zealand, I was in Indiana, went to New Zealand and Italy and got samples myself, because geology departments like that if you collect your own samples. But I also got some collaborators who gave me other KT boundary samples from USA, Canada, Spain, and Denmark. So these are like little packages coming in the courier full of clay. That's what I got, lots of those. And then back at the lab, I had to digest these samples in strong hot acids and oxidant. So I'm wearing the full chemical protection gear, and I've got 3 different types of acids: nitric acid, sulfuric acid, and hydrofluoric acid, boiling on a hot plate, and that's where I dump my clay. So I leave it boiling for 10 hours, and then I drop it in a strong oxidant, potassium dichromate. and let that boil for a while as well. And the only thing that's left after you do that to sediment is the soot, the black carbon. Black carbon is tough. It out-survives anything else. Yeah. So that also means it's going to be great for surviving long periods of time, right? So I would take what was left in the bottom of my test tube and look at it under an electron microscope, which is a very, very high-powered microscope, great for seeing small stuff. And this is what I found. So actually that's from another person's study, but I saw lots of it. These three are all photos that I took using the electron microscope. So this is acidiform soot, which you would expect to see. This is what you get out of a diesel tailpipe, a diesel-powered vehicle. This is a characteristic coal-fired power plant or oil-fired power plant particle called an SCP. And I found some of these as well in the North American sediments, which looks a bit like the stuff from the coal-fired plant. This one, up the top here, turned out to be a contaminant. Everywhere I went, I would take samples from the outcrop and the clay, and I would also take samples from the soil next to it, right? Or 10 yards away, just to make sure I wasn't measuring contaminants that had gotten into the outcrop. And that one turned out to be a contaminant. And that's a real classical industrial onset. People have written papers about how this is the particle when you look in sediments that marks the onset of the Industrial Revolution. You can see it from these particles. This one was not contamination. And it looks a little bit different to that one. But you're also looking at the elemental composition, so you can aim the beam of the electron microscope at these, and you can tell what the elements are. And they're all carbon, so you know what you're looking at. These are mineral beads, so these are made out of silica. Also from a coal-fired power station. Coal contains traces of silica in it. So this one's a bit ambiguous. You get it from diesel, but you can also get it from forest fires. Not so convincing. This one is a contaminant. Not so good. And this one was what I made my case about. Now, okay, so I'm a master's student. I want to publish. I found something cool. But number one, this doesn't look like a modern industrial contaminant. It looks like something else, but it's carbon. Maybe it's related and interesting in some other way. So I couldn't say I'd found an industrial civilization because I didn't have quite the right morphology. And it's amazing. There's just a body of literature on these particles that I was able to reference. And when I found it, I was so amazed and happy that I'd managed this massive discovery, and then really disappointed when I saw that they were also in my control samples. So, but these ones, that was a sort of it was good in a way. So what could I do with this discovery? So the morphology of the cenospheres, that's what you call them, is not exactly like the modern industrial type found in recent sediments. Science is very conservative. It's more difficult to publish something that is a radical departure from the status quo, especially if you're a master's student without any kind of track record. Perhaps there's another explanation, something I could publish, something that would at least put a stake in the ground that people could, the publication's great because people can refer back to it. If someone wanted to continue this investigation, they could look back at my study and use it. So really, it was really important to me to get published and at least make a contribution. So maybe there's another explanation. And if you just look at this photo, this is the Yucatan Peninsula, right? As it was at the 65 million years ago at the end of the Cretaceous, this illustration. So this is the Gulf of Mexico. Now, where are the largest oil fields in the world? Saudi Arabia, right? Where's the second largest oil field in the world? The supergiant oil fields.
Venezuela?
Canada?
Venezuela.
Canada.
Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
So the Cantarell oil field was exploited by Pemex, the Mexican national oil company, for about 40 years. It's been in decline now for about 15 years, but it's what's called a supergiant oil field. And what happened when the asteroid struck is it shattered the crust there. So it penetrated the ocean, it smashed up all the rocks on the ocean floor, and it created all this very porous, what they call reservoir rock. So this was a great place to grow an oil field, which is exactly what happened. And so the Cantarell oil field is a direct result of this asteroid impact. That's why we have had so much oil in the Gulf of Mexico, still do. But it's not just where the asteroid struck. This whole area was biologically rich. So oil deposits accumulate offshore. That's where all the major oil deposits are now. They have oil rigs that are offshore, and these quite sort of, some of it's quite deep out there now, but maybe 1,000 feet of water or less.
Is the Texas oil because of this as well?
I don't think so. I think the Gulf of Mexico was rich in oil prior to the asteroid strike because it was geologically similar to what it is now. The Cantarell was a direct result of the asteroid impact, but that whole environment was, you know how oil forms? It's plankton.
Yeah.
These tiny little plants live in the ocean, but they're everywhere. And when they die, they sink down to the bottom of the ocean and they form this organic rich ooze. And when that mud gets compacted and buried and cooked by a little bit of thermal energy, it turns into oil over millions of years. That was all there already when the asteroid struck. So my hypothesis was you had an asteroid struck the Gulf of Mexico and it just pulverized and vaporized this huge oil deposit that was already there and released particles into the atmosphere that look a bit like this, that I could see. The ones I also noticed that the biggest ones were closest to the oil field and the smallest ones were further away. So that was, anyway, this is what I wrote about, and it sort of refined the understanding of the event. They knew, scientists knew this stuff, this type of soot was really common on the KT boundary. So a scientist called Wendy Walbach at the University of Chicago made this discovery in the late 1980s. Everywhere she looked in the KT boundary, there's soot was everywhere. It looks a lot like diesel soot. But what she said was that it was forest fires. So the asteroid struck and caused all these forest fires all over the world. And my paper argued against that. I said, no, it wasn't forest fires, it was hydrocarbons that were present already in that target crust when the asteroid comes down. So that was what my paper was about. So this is some of the newspaper clippings from after the paper came out. It was a really fun story. So it got picked up and disseminated. And that's back in 2008. And so it wasn't sort of a home run on what I wanted to show, but it does draw attention to the similarity between the KP boundary extinction event and current techno-industrial civilization, in as much as what we're doing today is taking carbon out of the Earth's crust and putting it into the atmosphere. Well, it looks like maybe that's what happened at the time of the dinosaur extinction as well. So maybe they didn't have a civilization, but maybe other events caused there to be an enrichment of CO2 in the atmosphere at that time. And this is probably not a good thing. So I'm getting close, I think, to the end. So the legacy of the publication in 2008 so far, this paper, the Anthropocene, is functionally and stratigraphically distinct from the Holocene. So around about the time as I was writing this paper, people were starting to get the idea that there was a new geological epoch called the Anthropocene, which could be characterized by the Industrial Revolution, or the things that humans do that will be preserved in the fossil record forever. These are things like smoke particles, chemicals, microplastics. All these things will be considered markers that show when humans came onto the scene. Okay? They're going to call this epoch the Anthropocene. So this is a paper in Science, quite a seminal paper. It's been cited nearly 500 times in the last 2 years, and they cite me in there, which I'm fairly proud of. And cited the asteroid impact changed the history of life on Earth, the low probability of mass extinction. This is one that came out in Nature late last year and got a whole lot of media coverage. And my advisor at Indiana University, he emailed me and said, hey man, this paper hinges heavily on your paper. And if you read it, it really does. It's very cool that they were able to add some additional strength to what I found. They looked at the geochemistry of the black carbon in the sediments, and it looks a lot more like fossil carbon than it does carbon from forest fires. So that was a really nice reinforcement of my work, and got some media attention. And just this week, this is amazing. I was preparing for this talk late last week, and I'm doing keyword searches because I'm a bit rusty on this stuff. And this is what I came across doing a Google search. I was doing searches like pre-human civilizations, and I found this this hackers forum, and this guy had this is literally like 5 days ago. I put this post up. This is one of my all-time favourite what-if questions. Some years ago, a friend of mine coyly posed this same question to me: what does humankind make that would survive 60 million years into the future? And if some other advanced industrial civilization had existed 60 million years ago, how would we know? Well, it turns out my friend had put a lot of thought into the exact question enough to do a master's in geology. So at this point, my ears are really pricking up. I'm thinking, oh, this guy knows me, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, his work ultimately made me into high-profile journal with write-ups in places like New York Times. He started talking to various geologists about what might survive, buildings or structures of any sort, statues and monuments. Maybe we'd notice the odd deposit or two of minerals. Anyway, what Peter, I did know him, it turns out what he posted was this article which came out in the Atlantic, and this is just last week. Absolutely amazing timing, really weird. So this is the article that came out last week. Well, it's just been accepted for publication in astrobiology, and it's a guy at NASA and a guy at Rochester, University of Rochester, both like high-flying academics. And it's getting all this publication, all this publicity this week. So this is from 2 days ago. And this is the Atlantic article. And
When did that Atlantic article come out?
Last week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was there a civilization?
Yeah. So what these guys have done, and they had no idea what my philosophy was when I was doing my masters. I've looked into their paper. All they're saying is, hey, no one's looked. Maybe there's geochemical evidence, and we don't think there is, but this is a research gap. If ever there was a research, this is the mother of research gaps. So, and that's it. I kind of agree with them. I think it's highly unlikely there's anything out there, but wow, really worth checking, eh? And who knows what you'll find? It was a fun study, and I think it captures imagination. Yeah. So that Newsweek article was from the 18th, it's the 19th, yeah. Oh, that's the article that they just had accepted. This is this guy from NASA in Rochester. Yeah. Right, that's the talk. Thanks for listening. Happy to take any questions.
الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين